I was
Pretty
playing
sure it is.
Control. I played Control when
Don't
we
quote
were
me.
playing.
You can ask it.
While I was playing it in class one day. It's really fun. Before that, I think the last Borderlands, and then last game I got before that was Days Gone.
All right, we're back. We are COMP305. That's Game Programming 1 in the fall 2019 semester, and it is week 5. Just wanted to go over with you guys what's due this week before we move on. So, if we go to the original project overview for this week, which is kind of our guide to what we're doing. If you scroll down, you can see that this week, assignment 1 has been moved to this week. It's due this weekend. I know some people have asked for an extra day till Sunday. I will grant that if you need an extra day to do it. But Sunday is the final day. I can't extend it past Sunday, right? I also have one more thing that's due, which is we also have our first playable build, which is also due this week. There was a couple of exercises. I'm going to hold off on these exercises until second half semester, because I think what I'd like to do is it's worth 10%, and there's going to be some opportunities for us to do other things with that 10%. So I'm going to hold off with these things, and because you guys got enough going on already, I don't want to kill you guys with all the stuff that's happening. So let's wait for a little longer. Like maybe next week we'll do one if we can. There's going to be more meat on our 2D platformer by then. Your assignment 2 is due next 2 weeks from now on week 7. That's your exam week. So again, your first midterm exam coming up on week 7. As I mentioned last week, it'll be pretty basic. It'll ask you to put together a small project. It'll be an in-house or in-class assignment, more or less, that you'll be able to do. You'll be able to talk. You'll be able to look at the internet, open book, open code, whatever. Do whatever you have to do. I'll give you the full time to do it, and then you put together, your exam and you submit it. Okay, so that's the way it goes for next week. So that's 2 weeks from now. So that's week 7. So so today, one more thing is you have also a peer review number 2. That's also due. Peer review number 2 is kind of coupled with your first playable build today. For your first playable build, I've put up the Dropbox, so that's open. But if you scroll down into your project document, it tells me a couple things. One thing is it says link to live site. We haven't really talked about this yet, so let's just leave it out. And if you notice up on my project part 3, I didn't ask for this because I haven't really talked about how to do it. I want to use GitHub Pages for this for you guys, so you can use GitHub actually to promote your own game. But I want to show you how to do this, and it's going to take a little bit of time. It won't be today, okay? Game design document version 2. What does this mean? It means update your game design document with screenshots of your latest build, whatever that is, and any other adjustments, plans, or whatever that you've kind of put into it. So that's the game designer's job, whoever the game designer is on your team, to do that. I do want a GitHub link to your project repository. Make sure it's clean. So I don't want any builds in that repository or whatever. I should be able to just download your Unity project from GitHub and run it. That's what it should be. So if you can't do it, and you should try it, then I won't be able to do it. And if I can't do it, I can't test your build, I can't see where you're at, and I can't give you a good mark. So please do that. Don't wait till that's done. Also, I know sometimes what people do, I gotta say it, right, is they are due dates today and then they push something later on, like tomorrow, right? I'm not going to count that push. I'm going to go back to the previous push, the one you pushed for today, and that's what I'm going to look at. So if you push something tonight and it's due tonight, no problem. If you push something tomorrow but it's due tonight, then I'll ignore the new push. That push will be for another build. Okay, so just letting you know. So that's really where we're at when it comes to this. Any questions around our due dates and our time frame and all that kind of stuff? I know it's a lot that's coming at you, and I'm sure that all the other courses that you got going on are also, pushing you around with different work, right? I'm sure like the workload is getting significant at this point, right, in terms of what you have due. Hang in there, guys. I always tell from a strategy perspective, even if you have something that's not quite done and you're not proud of it, but it meets most of the requirements, hand it in. It's better to hand in something than nothing. Nothing gives you 0. Handing in something gives you something, some marks. You're not going to get 0 marks from me ever, right, when you hand something in. So do that, please. And that's it. Let's talk about platforming a little bit. So again, we're going to build a platformer today, starting to build a platformer today in Unity. Let's get there. So the first thing I'd like to do is I want to make a new Unity project. So I made one earlier today. I called it Lesson 5 for the first class that came in. I'm going to make a new one. We're just going to call it COMP305 Fall 2019 semester, and it's Lesson 5B, which is what yours is going to be. Okay. So just all I'm going to do in the beginning is I'm going to configure it. I've also put up some assets for this platformer up online, so I'm going to refer to those up on eCentennial soon. So as soon as it's ready to go. So I gotta say some stuff about platforming or building a platformer in general. It's way more difficult in many ways than a side scroller to do right, I think is the right way to say it. I think you can make a little platformer and it's there can be some very simple ways of doing it, but to do it right and to have good gameplay, it takes a lot of tweaking. So let's keep that in mind as we're going today. I'm going to pull this down in here so we have our pro build. Okay, so again, what I want to do is I want to set up my project the right way, and you'll have to also do this on your test. So scenes. So make sure you set up your project so it has all the piece parts that it needs. I'm also going to make a new scripts folder. We're going to make a bunch of more folders. We're going to have a material folder. I'm going to have a models folder, but I'm not going to use it today. And then there's going to be a textures. Probably should be called materials. More than one material. Prefabs for sure. I'm also going to make an animations folder. We're going to talk about that today a lot. Part of the thing that we're talking about today is animations for platforming. Before we even create a platform, we're going to actually make a character, add their animations, talk about the character finite state machine, all that stuff that we're going to do in the animation section. We also need audio. And you can add more along the way. Alright, so that's kind of the basics. I also I have some assets, so if you look up on eCentennial, let's go to eCentennial for a second, you can see that I've added platformer assets here. You can certainly download that if you want to follow along. Okay. But you can use any assets you want as long as they make sense to you for this build. So what I'm using, there's some interesting assets, and they pose a few challenges for us, and I want to talk about that. Next week, what I want to try and do with you guys is continue with the platformer, but talk about tile maps and how to use those properly. There's also potentially some scriptable objects that we can kind of look at, which might be good. So again, if you look at the assets that I have under textures, I'm going to populate some sprites. So it's just all this stuff. So coin, enemy, hero, and tiles. I'm just going to drag and drop that into Unity. That's under textures. And then under audio, I'm going to go back to the sounds folder and grab those ones and bring them in. So that gives you kind of like a little starting base if you want to follow along. Okay. So let's talk about our first asset, and I want to talk about it in two ways. One, pros and cons of doing things in different ways, and I need your opinion, and I'm always looking for that because I think it's good. So here's one of my challenges. So I've given you some assets, and some of you have been doing some you learn platforming with Wallace as an example, but here's some sprites. Here is the hero sprites. Okay, look at idle, 01, 02, 03, all these different things. You can see there's a ton of them. This is definitely one way of doing it. Pros of doing it this way. Drag and drop onto the hierarchy and good to go, but there's a lot of different images that you have to deal with. Cons, right? And cons also is in terms of load, if these are bigger, like these are only 4K, so really small, but if these are bigger, there'd be a lot more file kind of manipulation. And so that might not be a thing. Also, from an organizational perspective, passing all these images, there's many files I got to send off, and so on. It might be better for us to use a Sprite Sheet. So we'll talk both ways of doing things. We'll do it with a Sprite Sheet and without a Sprite Sheet. So let's show you how to do it without a Sprite Sheet first. So again, going back to Unity, I want to make a player. So again, before we do any platforming today, I want to establish my player prefab. I want to create all of his animations. That's what I want. And then we'll work on the platforms and everything else, okay? So here's our textures. So we have under the hero folder, I have several textures. If I look at the first one, you can see that it is a 2D and UI sprite. It's 100 pixels per unit, so we're using a compression ratio. We're not doing a pixel perfect game. And if I take all of the idle animations, which happen to be 24 of them, that's, in my opinion, excessive, but this is the assets let's say your artist gave you. And if I drag and drop these assets, so all the idle animations all together, if I drag and drop them onto the hierarchy, then you're going to get two things. One, a dialog box comes up like this, and it says, hey, what do you want to call your animation? It says create new animation. So there's two parts to this. One is the animation clip. The other part is your Animator Controller. Two parts, right? But we want to call this the idle animation. So I'm just going to call this idle and press enter. What this does is it creates a couple things. One, your actual object here, the player object. I'm just going to turn off gizmos for now. So here's the player object. This is what it looks like. Okay, he's a funny little character. It's called idle, and I have two things, an idle clip as well as an idle animator. Now this is okay, but imagine if I had a bunch of different animations here, that would be an issue. Also from a game perspective, he's quite small, right? And I'm going to have to scale him up. When I scale him up, I'm going to do that through programmatically scale him up, basically. I'm going to go into my transform. So here I'm on the character. Let's say I rename this guy player. So let's make this player. And let's go into my scale, and I want to make him at least twice as big. So he's going to be this big. There we go. And so here I've modified his scale. It's not terrible, but this is what I have to do now. You can see that he's a little bit better in terms of the frame of the game. I think that's a little better. But that's him, right? If I was to run the game, by default, you have this simple animation. So again, if you sit there, because I dragged everything in, you have a little bit of an idle animation, and that's just a combination of all these idle frames, 24 frames of animation here, that I just dragged and dropped onto the hierarchy. A couple things happened when I did that. Again, one thing that happened was this idle 0001. And if you look at this, we can really rename this the Player Animator Controller. That's really what it is. And just to keep it clean, I have an animations folder. I'm going to make a new folder under the animations folder called Hero, right? And inside my Hero folder, I'm going to take that player animation controller and drop it in. So again, I'm just going to drag it into animations. I'll fix that in a second. And then you have this thing here, an idle clip. So I'm just go back to the animations folder and then take these two things and drop it in. Okay, so what's the difference between an animation controller and the animation itself? So the animation controller looks like this. It's actually a visual state machine. So it's visual scripting that Unity gives us. It creates something called a state machine, or a finite state machine. You have an entry point for the state machine, and then several animation states. One of them, or the first one, is the idle state, right? When you run your code, so if I run this thing, and if I go back to the scene, or the Animator Controller, you can see that what's happening is that right now, nothing's going on. It's just going from here to there, and it keeps on doing that over and over again, right? We're going to see that's going to change in a bit. Your animation window, so there's animation window and there's the animator window that I'm looking at. And by the way, if you don't have those, you can go to window, animation, and you can put up either the animation window or the animator window. Those are the two windows that you get, okay? The animation window looks at the clip. So if you can see here, and if I scroll in, there's several frames here, 24 frames of animation for your idle that you got going on here. That's what it is. And again, the way I can see that is if I click on the idle animation, right? Sometimes it'll give you a preview. It won't do that here. A couple things to note when you click on the clip. So I'm not clicking on the. There's two things that were created, right? And they look like this. I'll give you the icons a little larger. An icon that looks like this is the clip. An icon that looks like this is the Animator Controller. Okay. And you can see, you can actually see that this is like it looks like some visual scripting here with some connections. I think Unity did a good job of separating these two icons. This one looks like it's a clip, so this one you can actually play. This one here is control over all your clips. So the clip, it has, if you click onto it, has this option, loop time. And if you want an animation to loop, you leave that checked. If you don't, if you only want to play the animation one time, you uncheck this, okay? The player animator controller, though, this one, if I look at it and if I double click onto it, has, it's almost like I've dragged this idle clip. And if, by the way, I can delete this. I have my, let's suppose I have my animator controller. And if I take an existing clip and I drag and drop it on, it becomes the default clip that runs when your animation instantiates, right, in the scene. And you have a connection from entry point to idle that basically says that, hey, this idle animation here is going to run. Here is the speed. So speed, what it does, you can increase the amount of how fast your frames play, and by whatever factor you want. You can increase the speed, or you can actually add a multiplier. It's truly up to you. So that's the kind of basics about how an animation is formed. But imagine if, and again, I can totally do this for each animation. For example, let's do another one, and then I'll stop and I'll go back. Imagine if in the hero folder where I have my textures, I just did idle, but what I want to do is I want to do jump. So here's jump. And then there's walk. And I got to keep doing this every single time. So I go down this, and I put it down. We're going to do this anyway, but this would be the jump animation. Okay, so it's my jump animation. I'm going to get an animator controller, which I don't need. Let's just delete that one. And I do get a jump clip. This is what I do need. And if I go back, I can take this jump clip and put it inside the hero folder in the animations folder. And you can see now that I have another clip, my jump clip. And what I need to do to include another clip is literally just drag and drop my jump clip alongside my idle clip. So idle, then I can jump. Idle, maybe I can walk. There's different kind of states that my player can kind of go through. But my challenge is it's pretty polluted, like in terms of the way it looks. If you look at hero, it looks like there's a ton of stuff in here, right? And imagine if I had not just these 3 sets of animations, but 30 more, right? Like for him to crouch, fire a gun, use a lasso, use some kind of grappling hook, pick up an item, drop an item, punch somebody, get punched, whatever, die, get back up. There's like a bunch of stuff that I can have here. And obviously the more little animations you have, they each have, several amount of frames, 6 to 10 frames at, on average. you know, for 30 different animations, that's like a lot of frames, and searching through this thing can be really crazy, right? So there are a couple approaches you can use. You can put all this into a sprite sheet, so at least it's like almost like a mini folder. You could also take parts of this animation, the textures, and break it off into subfolders. You can do that too. I mean, you can do whatever you like, but generally what you want to do is you want to make one sprite sheet that each of your characters kind of use. So what is a sprite sheet? I want you to think about it again as a texture atlas. You have this, instead of having one texture, there's many textures that this one image shares, right? So it is. So a bunch of textures, a bunch of images that are kind of embedded inside of a larger image. And then what you can do, you can basically tell Unity to go from one image on that same sprite sheet to another one. That's what you're doing. So let's undo all these things. Let's get rid of the player. And let's just delete everything and start over. And it's a good thing to see it anyway, because it'll be a chance for you guys to do it one more time. Alright, so they're gone. So what if we were going to use a sprite sheet? How do I do that? How do I make a sprite sheet? You can certainly do it by hand. So you can go through and open up your favorite editor, drag and drop a bunch of sprites in there, right? And you get a sprite sheet. Yay! And then you can cut it up in Unity, and if there's 300 frames, all the power to you, right? Or, which I like to do, I like to use a tool called Texture Packer. So it looks like this. It's on, if you go codeinweb.com/texture packer. I think it's a great little tool. I don't work for Texture Packer. I don't endorse some Texture Packer. I'm not getting paid by Texture Packer, but I can tell you I've been using it for years. And the really cool thing about it is that it is compatible with many different kinds of game making software. Unity, Unreal. You can make it if you're doing web web game programming. You can use it for that. If you're using libgdx for Android development, you can use it for that. If you're using SpriteKit for iOS development, you can use it for that. In fact, I do use it for all these different things, and I think it's really worthwhile. So what is Texture Packer? First of all, you can download it. If you click on download, there's different versions. It's compatible with Mac, Linux, and Windows, of course. One thing is you can download it, and it'll be, I believe, a 7-day trial where you can use it and check it out. It's not free though. That's the way it is. I think it's a good product, but if you go to store, you can see that for 1 year, Texture Packer is $54.99. You can still use it past 1 year, which is really, really cool. It's just that you won't get free updates. You'll have to upgrade. Or if you click lifetime, you spend $134, and then you have Texture Packer for life, right? Which is really good. You get all kinds of free updates. These guys are really active, and they've got a plugin for Unity that we're going to use later on. Okay, so I'm going to use it. You can download it and try it yourself, but I'm also going to put up the files that I create up on eCentennial, so you can use my files that I created with Texture Packer to practice using sprite sheets. Okay, so how does this look? So first of all, I have this in Unity, but I have Texture Packer downloaded. So I'm just like let me start Texture Packer. Here's my Texture Packer. Here's how it looks. What it does is it's a little program, and I have an area here on the left that I can drag and drop. So I'm going to open up my files. Here's my hero files. I'm going to select all the files that I want to use and then drag and drop them into this area like this. What it does is it immediately creates a texture atlas. That's what this is, right? That includes all of my sprites. Okay? So you're going to say, okay, what do you do, Tom? Who cares, right? But actually, what it does, it also allows you to preview what some of these animations will look like. So if I select all the idle animations and I click on preview animations, you can see that this is what the idle animations look like. You can also change the speed of the idle animation and see if it looks better or worse. All that testing can be done here outside of Unity. Cool, so I've got these animations. Now there's different options with Texture Packer. One thing is you're going to get output, a data file, as well as a texture file. The texture file is going to be the sprite sheet. The data file is almost going to be a map that's going to tell Unity where to look on your sprite sheet to find your images. So you don't have to manually cut the sprite sheet in pieces. What this does is it'll cut it for you. It'll slice it all for you, and when it goes into Unity, it'll be perfectly sliced in the right way, and it'll work nicely. So let's use a data file. I'm going to just decide the data file is going to be called my Hero Atlas. That's what I'm going to call it. And again, I'm going to work from a new project, not the old one. So it's this one here, 5B. I'm going to go into Assets, and inside of my textures, I'm going to create, inside my hero texture, I'm going to create another folder called Sprites. So inside of my Sprites folder, I'm going to kind of save my Hero Atlas in there. It's also going to create a Hero Atlas.png file. So that is the actual sprite sheet. The sprite sheet itself plus a configuration file. There's two files, okay, that it gives you. Now, some options. One, the maximum size of my file. It's a 2K file max, right? So 2048 by 2048. You can certainly make it bigger. You can go to 8K if you really want to, if there's a lot of detail you want to use. Size constraints. Power of 2 is pretty much standard. A lot of computer programs, especially if you're using C++ or if you're using JavaScript, they really do prefer, from an efficiency perspective, guys who are in the web game program, power of 2 is the way you go, right, for the shape of your sprite sheet. And then, remember we have that pesky problem of scaling? Well, I can scale it right here. So I can actually do a pre-scale of my images outside of Unity, which is way better. So I'll do it here, 2, which scales everything twice as large as it normally would be scaled without me having to go in and use kind of manually scale things in Unity. Then the algorithm that I'm going to be using to pack these images together, there's several of them, but the one of them that's really good is basic, which kind of puts everything in a row. You can also use sort by name, so you can pack several of all the idols together. So you can see that these are all packed together. If you don't like basic, the other really good one is grid strip. What grid strip does is it actually makes it evenly spaced, which I like a lot. So there's your evenly spaced grid strip. Okay. One of the challenges with this is that there's a bit of an offset when you do it this way. So on the positive side, if you use grid strip, then every single sprite is the exact same size. On the negative side, it will offset your center of mass a little bit to the right, as an example in this case. So this is also a good option. I'm going to go back to basic for a second, because basic does not require that you have the same sprite size. Next is border padding. I would recommend adding 1, and definitely 1 to shape padding, just to give you a little bit of padding between shapes, especially when you want to pack everything together. Alright, so now that I have my sprite sheet, it's pretty simple. All I have to do is click Publish Sprite Sheet. And when I publish Sprite Sheet, it's going to write those 2 files and a sprite sheet that's 1024 by 1024 inside my Unity project. But I'm not done yet. In order for me to use it properly, what I need to do is I need to use a little plugin for Unity called Texture Packer Importer. So let's go back to Unity. As you can see, under the Sprites folder, I have now a Hero Atlas, but there's only one of them. And what I want to do is I need to re-import this when I have Texture Packer Importer in. So how do I get that? I got to go to the Asset Store, and I'm going to type in Texture Packer Importer. So again, sorry, I'm a little bit magnified here, so you're going to get a bit of a difference. Texture Packer Importer, there it is. And what I want to do with this is let's just bring this out here. I want to do this is I want to make this I want to download this thing, right? or install it. So that's what I want to do with this one. So if I click onto it, it tells you that I can import. That's what I want to do. So I import. Now one thing to note is that this will give you not just some tools, but also some examples of your code. And I'm going to import. And just like any asset from Unity, from the Unity Asset Store, you'll get some extras. You'll get some examples, which is really, really cool. And it'll tell you how to use the plugin. Alright, so what did it give us now that we downloaded it? If you look, it gave us a couple of changes. One, it added this folder, codeandweb.com. Now, I would like to put this in another folder to hide it. Usually I have an imported assets folder, but in this case what this plugin does is it looks for certain things on the in a certain spot, so I can't move it. But what it does do is allow me to go back into my textures, into my hero, into my sprites, and I can re-import this sprite. If I go back, if I open this up, I go down to Texture Packer and I say reload Sprite Sheets. What this is going to do is it should, may have to actually re-import it. Let's just re-import these two things. If I go to re-import, a lot of times, yeah, there we go. A lot of times what it'll do is it'll cut it up for me. Take a look. So all these are cut up now. They're double the size and they're inside my Hero Atlas, perfectly in there. All right. It's a great way of doing something when it comes to you know, your sprite sheets. For you guys, if you want to follow along and you want to use my assets, again, if you go up on eCentennial, you'll see that there are a few of them. There's a Hero Atlas. There's also an Enemy Atlas that I made earlier today. You can totally download these and use them in Unity as if I did this for you, like you already did Texture Packer. So you can check out what it does for you. Alright, so here's my atlas. Let's do that thing again that I did. I'm going to grab idle 0 to idle 24. So these 24 frames, right? And I'm going to drag and drop it into the hierarchy. This is how we make the animation. So boom. I'm going to call this thing idle with a capital I. And what this is going to do for us is it's going to create a couple of files. One of them is the clip, the other one is the Animator Controller, like we talked about before. I'm going to move these two files into the Animations Hero folder. And I'm going to rename this one, and again this one is, there's two files. One of them is the clip. Again, look at the icon, looks like this. This is the Animator Controller. I'm going to call this the Hero Animator Controller, right? And this is the one that I'm going to add to. The idle clip is the first clip, and again, I'm going to rename this guy as the player. Oh, if I can actually type player, how about that? There we go. And if I play it, you can see now that he's going to have his little idle animation. One thing to note is that the scale is automatically bigger because I set that scale outside of Unity. It looks really good. Now I got to caution you. When I use this asset, this little guy, I use him for a reason. It's for teaching reasons. I don't recommend that this is a great asset to use. But let me explain why I like him. He's got a really big head, like a massive head. And this is going to make it very interesting when you make your colliders and your collider choices. What are you going to do for this guy? Should I use a circle collider or some kind of other kind of capsule collider up here? Should I use another one down here? What am I going to do? And what if I did that? That means that, like, if his head hit the bottom of a platform, he can actually like hang from his neck, like literally, right? Like he can actually just sit there and like not move, right? Which is not cool, right? I mean, you don't want that kind of, unless that's the kind of game you want to make, right? But that's kind of weird, right? That the fact that this is happening, right? Now, one other thing to note is that these animations were made by whatever artist made these things. Notice that this is all one piece. Sometimes what we do these days is we will talk about this a little bit more next week. We can use something called Anima 2D. I'm not sure if you all talked to you about that. I'm sure he did. He's really happy about that little addition to Unity. But what it does is allows you to break I would like go into a graphic manipulation program and break this little guy up, right, into different pieces. I would grab his legs and his arms and his head separately as much as possible. And then what you can do is you can rig up his arms and legs and head and with bones, and you can make your own animations here in Unity. I don't think it's a negative idea. I think it's pretty cool. It gives you a lot more variability when it comes to all the different kinds of poses and things that he can do. But for the most part, guys, whenever you want to make an animation, you do it in a graphics program and then you bring it in. Alright, so that's the player so far. He's got one little idle animation. I need to add the other one. So let's get that done. I'm going to go back to sprites. Again, I'm going to look in the sprite sheet and let me just look at the next one. So he's got two more. I've got jump, like I talked about, so I'm going to bring that in. And we'll call this jump. And I'll do the other one at the same time, walk. So there's walk. And I'll drag that in. And then it'll be called walk. Alright, so a couple of them, I can get rid of these game objects. They're just there. They're generated. And what I want to do is when I get rid of the animator controllers, I don't need those, because those are extra animator controllers that I don't need, so I can get rid of them. And then I have two clips, jump and walk, and I can take those jump and walk clips and drag them into my hero animations folder. So I have this now. Under my hero animations, I have idle, jump, and walk. Idle, jump, and walk. And if I look at my animator controller, I only have idle. This is what it looks like. But now we're going to get to this point where I want to drag in jump and I want to drag in walk. So those are the three different states that my hero can have. Idle, jump, and walk. Alright, question for you guys, and this is like not a difficult question. Can I go from idle to jumping? What do you think? Is that a possibility for my hero? I would say yes, right? And can I go from jumping or idle to walk? Yes. And can I go from walking to jumping? How about jumping back to walking? So all those are yeses, and jumping back to idle. So what I'm going to make is connections between all this stuff into a bit of a triangle. So I'm going to start with idle, and the way you do this in your animator controller, and again, notice what I did. I grabbed my clips and I dragged and dropped them inside this area here. Okay. Now some of these need to be adjusted. For example, I noticed that jump in our last session was a little bit slow, so I want to make that twice as fast. I also want to do the same thing for walking. I thought the walk speed was really slow, so I'm going to make that twice as fast. Okay, so those are the things I'm going to make. However, my idle speed was pretty good and it has 24 frames. I'm pretty happy with that. Cool, so I've got these three little states and I want to connect them. I can go from idle, and if I right click on the idle clip, I get a choice that says make transition. Then I can make a transition from my idle animation to my jump animation. So I mean, it's possible to go this way. I also want to make one from my jump to my idle, from my jump to my walk, from my walk to my jump, from my idle to my walk. Oops. To my walk and back the other way. So now I have this little triangle. Again, visual scripting built into Unity. However, we have to talk about some issues that come with doing this. One of them is the transitions. Notice that on the right, I have this blend tree, this blend stuff happening right here. So yeah, blending is nice if depending on the kind of animation, but in our case, we don't want this kind of blending too much. Also, we don't want to have exit time. Does anyone know what exit time means? It's a thing. So again, every transition connection has these options. So exit time, again, if you hover over it, says a transition has a fixed exit time, which means that before I transition from one animation to another, so again, from idle to walk, I gotta wait until my idle is done. If my idle's not done, I'm not walking. To me, that's a negative. So that has to come out. And that has to come out at every single one of these transitions. You can't wait for you to do it in this kind of game and come back. You're not doing a cinematic. You're doing an animation. So I'm going to kind of get all these away. Take all these idle times. Okay, so that's just getting rid of them all. Just give me a warning at the bottom, which we're going to disregard for now. And we're going to fix that later. So I'm just taking exit time off from all of them. Okay, next. When I transition from idle to jump, there is a blend. I want to take that blend down to almost nothing. So I want to say that the blend, the time for us to go, is fairly small. I do want my jumping animation to be there, but going from idle to jumping, right, as an example, I want my jumping to be, by the way, you can move where your jumping animation happens and how long it occurs. As an example, you can also increase it by adding additional animations. The more blending you do, the more animations you'll do. But we want to keep this really small, like super small, right? I want to do the same thing on the way back. So I'm going to kind of take these little transitions and cut them right down. And the same thing goes with all the other ones. So let's just do that really quickly. Okay, now that I've reduced all the transition times, I'm ready to put in some code or a little bit of work so that I can move from one animation to the other. Now this is the basic way to do it. There's other ways too. But what I want to do is when I trigger when a variable changes, right, I can move from one animation state to the other. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to trigger a variable in my Animator Controller to change the value, and it's going to move. So in order for me to do that, I have to have a parameter. So if you go to the top here, there's parameters. And what I want to do in this Animator Controller, click the plus button here. It's going to give me several options. One of them is int, float, boolean, and trigger. I want to use int for now. Int. And you'll see why I prefer int. I'm going to call this anim state. Anim state. And you see that the value for anim state, the variable anim state, starts off at 0. Okay, so I went to parameters, clicked the plus button, added an integer, and then called it anim state, made the value start off at 0. Cool. So now that I have that, I have the ability for me to make different states cost different values. For example, my idle state is going to be the 0 integer value. But for me to move from idle to walk is going to be worth 1. If I change my integer value in my anim state variable from 0 to 1, I want it to shift to the walk animation. And from 1 to 2, 2 is going to be the jump animation. So how do I do that? So I go to these transitions. So from 0 to go to jump, I need to change. I'm going to go over here on the right where it says conditions. I'm going to change this anim state variable from that equals to 2. So 2 means jump. If I go back from jump to idle, I'm going to change my anim state to equal to 0. Right? So again, 2 jump equals to 2. Back from jump to idle is equal to 0. How about from idle to walk? This arrow, it's going to be equal to 1. And from walk back to idle, again, that's going to go back to 0. When it equals to 0, it's going to go back this way. And from walk to jump, that's going to be equal to 2. Again, I'm in keeping with the kind of convention I'm using. And from jump to walk, that's going to be equal to 1. Yeah.
For the other one, should be equal to 2, greater than. I believe.
Did I make it greater?
Yeah.
Thank you. That would be bad. And I'm just checking them all, make sure I didn't mess up anywhere else. Let's check it again. So idle to thing is 1, back is 0, 2, back is 0, 2, back is 1. Good. Okay, so I think it looks good. So we've finished off our Animator Controller for our hero so far. All right, this part here. So why did I do all this work? Because this enables me to program the change to go from anim state 0 to anim state 1 or 2 or whatever I want to do. Okay. By the way, this same stuff you can use for user interfaces, you can use for particle systems, you can use for fires that are burning, you can use for explosions, you can use for sound, you can use for artificial intelligence, you can use it for so much, this stuff that's built in. Okay, so it's pretty cool, and there's zero coding so far. Okay, all we're doing is we're just setting up some, again, some visual scripting. Okay, cool. So we've got this part down. Let's go back to the player now. And here's my little player. And what I want to do with him is, he's got his animations going. If I actually run the code right now, all he does is stay idle for the whole time. He doesn't move. And I want to be able to test different states. But remember, I'm going to have to remember those funky numbers. I'm going to have to remember 0 means idle, 1 means walking, and 2 means, jumping. And you know what if I had, like, again, 30 more of those? Crouching, firing, rolling, dying, throwing, catching, picking things up, dropping things down, and I can keep going. I'm sure you can think of a lot of different things. Climbing up, climbing down, swinging on a rope, grappling hook, whatever, right? Getting hit in the head, hitting in the head, jumping on a head, whatever, right? And then you can keep going for all these different kinds of animations. It's too much to remember is what I'm trying to get at, right? So I want a enumeration to help me. So the first thing I'm going to code in my scripts is a little enumeration to help me remember the states. So I'm going to go right click, I'm going to add a new C# script that I'm going to call hero anim state, right? I'm going to double click on this to bring up my little Visual Studio code, or Visual Studio actually. And what I want to do here is, I don't need mono behavior, so let's get rid of that, because this is just a enumeration, so an enum. One day, when Visual Studio wants to do my bidding. Do my bidding. All right. There we go. And I don't need these anymore. I don't need these methods, because they're not something that enumerations have. I also want to make my enumeration inside of, just like we did last time, inside of a namespace called util. So I want to grab all this stuff and put it inside there. And I also want to make my class, or my enumeration, system serializable, which allows me to use my enumeration anywhere without attaching it to an object, which is cool. Okay, now what are my states? The first one is idle. Then one is walk. And then jump. Those are the 3 states that I have so far. I can add other ones. I can also add number of states. I'm not going to do that here. But this is the first thing that I have. I have an idle, walk, and jump. And idle means 0, walk is 1, and jump is 2, but I don't have to remember that anymore, especially if I have 30 more of those. I don't want to remember all those things. It's too much. Now let's make the player controller. So again, we're going back to Unity. I'm going to make a new C# script that we're going to call player controller. There we go. And maybe if we spell it right, that would be good. Rename. That is always bad when I name it wrong. Or name it not quite in my conventions. There we go. Okay, player controller. Yay. And if I double click onto it, I definitely want to change this name to player controller with a capital C, but that's just my error. And I also want to have using util, which will allow me to access that little enumeration I just made, right? And the first thing I want to do is I want to add that enumeration in. So I'm going to say public hero anim state is hero anim state. There we go. And I'm going to say that my hero anim state, lowercase, is equal to hero anim state dot idle. I'm going to start off with an idle state. And what this is going to do when I attach this script, this C# script, to the player, so I take this player object, which now has an animator and a sprite renderer. I'm going to take my my player controller, and I'm going to kind of drag it on. You can see that immediately it has a hero anim state of idle. It shows me my state. And this is great because I can actually watch the player change states from an idle state to a walk state to a jump state to whatever state I want. And I can also, if I want to, change the state here and have it respond. That's what I really want. Are you with me? Maybe some of you are watching. But the idea is that I want to make an enumeration so that way I can detect when my player is changing his animation states. Okay, cool. So now going back to player controller, here I am. And what I want to do with this one is this. I want to say that there's going to be different triggers that are going to make me change my state. primarily it's going to be my, you know, when I press the A and D buttons, my A and D buttons are going to move me left and right, right? And if I want to use a controller, gamepad, joystick, whatever, then I can do that, and my gamepad will let me move my player left and right as well. Okay? So if that's the case, I want to use this. If input get axis horizontal, I want to use this basic axis. If that is greater than 0, then really what I'm doing is I'm moving right. So this is move right. Similarly, I'm just going to copy paste here. Similarly, if input.getAxis horizontal is less than 0, then I'm moving left. Again, the axis that I get, it goes from -1 to 1. That is how it's normalized. And also, what about if I don't have anything, if I'm not, you know, doing any one of those two, if it's not greater than or less than 0, but it's actually equal to 0. So if I say if it's equal to 0, then I'm not moving at all. I'm actually idle state, right? So idle, move right, move left. And the other one I want is I want to be able to jump, and there's actually an axis for that. All right, so I can say something like, if I want to jump, if input.getAxis jump, that's what it's called, is greater than 0, then I want to jump. But what if input.getAxis jump is equal to 0? Well, then I'm not jumping anymore, right? However, that's a weird thing. It's like jumping or not jumping, right? Got to figure this out, because I don't want to do anything not to jump. I could also figure that the space bar is the one that I'm using to jump, but the space bar may not be always the thing that I'm using. Maybe I'm going to use my some kind of key on my controller to jump, right? So I want to kind of have the negation of this. And again, I could say something like not jumping, right? And I can take this and I can say, well, when this is equal to 0, right, then I'm not jumping, right? Because those two states. So this kind of negates this one if this is happening. And I'm checking all this stuff. These are all my inputs. And as you can see, I'm checking if it's greater than or less than 0 and so on. By the way, could I put this in a different format? What do you think? I got all these different things. Each one of them is an if statement. I can't do them all at once, but what do you recommend? Is there some other structure I can use here instead of an if statement? Switch case, which is better, right? However, the problem is that I can't switch case get axis horizontal and get axis jump. They're two different cases completely, right? So I'd have to have like two different switch cases if I really wanted to. For now, I'm going to leave it like this. All right, cool. So now here's what I want to do. When my input.getAxis horizontal is equal to 0, I'm in idle state. So I'm going to do one of these. I'm going to say that the hero anim state is equal to this thing here, which is the hero anim state idle. When I'm going to the right, the hero anim state is right, which is walk. When I'm going to the left, I'm also walking. When I'm jumping, then this is jump. And when I'm not jumping, then we have to assume that I'm idle for now. And this is dangerous. This is really dangerous, because what if I'm going from jumping and I'm coming back to this? That means I'm never going to be other than idle. That's an issue, right? So I'm jumping and I'm not jumping anymore, right? So that the animation is going to be weird. I got to figure this out, right? Because this is going to cause an issue with my jumping, not jumping. Just saying, right? All right, so one way that I also need it, I have this animation state, and what it does right now, if I go and run Unity, it doesn't move my guy, it doesn't even animate my guy. But one thing I can tell you is in my player state, when I'm running, take a look at this now. So here's my idle state, and if I press the right button, right, So I want to kind of press the right button or the D button or the A button. So D button or A button. We should have a change of state right here. Idle should go to walk or jump, right? So why is that not happening? Right? Because now we got to check this out. So we're going to say, let's just check it and see what's happening here. So it says update. Okay, cool. And then it's this, right? It's not jump, then it's idle. And it's always going to stay idle. So this presents an issue for us. It does present an issue when it comes to jumping, not jumping. If I go back, you'll see what I'm talking about. If I take that out and run it again, then you can see that if I press the right, I'm walking now. See, walking. And then if I stop pressing it, I'm idle. If I press left, I'm walking. And if I press the space bar, I'm jumping, and I go back to idle. Why? Because the other one is already there, and it doesn't leave me in jumping state. As long as I press the space bar, I'm good. So I really don't need this one because this one is taking care of it. Okay, just FYI. Okay. Here's another thing I could do. I could make if else. If else if else if else if. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, it could mean that I'm only doing one or the other thing. But what if I'm running and jumping? That's possible with this system, right? I can run and jump, right? In that order, by the way. Notice that walking happens first, and then running, and then jumping. I mean, right? I can't be idle walking. That's not possible. And I can't be idle jumping. But I could be walking and jumping afterwards, right? So that's why I can't really make these if, else, because it means I can only do one of them. So there's some interesting logic here. So one thing is that now I've changed my states, but they actually don't do anything. In order for me to make the animation change, what I need to do is I need to have access to the Animator Controller that's in my player. So notice there's an animator here. I need to have access to this thing, which means there's two ways I can do it. I can create a public property and drag and drop, or I can use get component, right? So I'm going to use the drag and drop method. Again, we're going to fix this later. I'm going to call this public Animator Controller. Animator Controller. Did I make it properly? What the? Well, that's weird. What the hell? Animation. Yeah, isn't that weird? It's not coming up. But really what it is this, right? This is this animator, right? Let's just call it animator. And what this will call this the hero animator. Hero animator. Okay. So my hero animator, what it does is it allows me to change the state. So this is how it works. So when I'm not doing anything, I want the hero animator. Here's when I'm not doing it. The hero animator. This one. I want to set integer, because remember my parameter, going back to Unity for a second, if you look at my animator controller, here's my animator controller, I have a parameter which is an integer of 0. So, and it's called anim state. So I want to set integer, and again we can use a friendly word for that, anim state, to 0. But I'm not going to use 0, I'm going to use int hero anim state dot idle. And this one will tell Unity that I'm going to go in the idle state. Now, again, a little clearer than just putting 0, right? Because 0 may not mean anything to you, especially if you come back to this project, you know, a month from now and go, what's 0 again? Oh, wait, let me look at the animator. Wait, what's 25 again? Wait, let me look at the animator. And I have to keep going back and forth. It's too much, right? So this way, when I'm not horizontal, will set my animation to 0. How about when I walk to the right? When I walk to the right, I want my animation to go to walk. right? And how about when I walk to the left? Uh-oh, don't I want to like look left? How do I do that? We'll talk about that in a second. And what about when I'm jumping? I want my thing to jump, right? So those are all the commands you need to change your animation state to different things. Walking, jumping, idle, those are all the different ones, okay? However, we need one more thing. If you look at the sprite renderer, there is actually something called flip. It's built into Unity Sprite Renderer. And when I go left, I want to be able to flip my sprite. And what it does is it flips it across the x-axis. It actually scales it across the x-axis and flips it the other way. So normally, when I look at my guy, he's pointing to the right. His default look is right. But if I click X, he actually flips to the left, right, which is kind of cool. So that I don't have to have, you know, two different sets of animation. An animation when my character's moving to the right, another one when my character's moving to the left. And I imagine if I had 30 animations, I would have to have 60 animations. That makes no sense. So that's why we just flip the sprite from one thing to the other. Now that's going to present a problem. And let me explain why. Here's the center of mass for the character. My center of mass is right here. That means his center of mass will flip to the other side, right? This is going to affect everything from his collider to all kinds of stuff. It'll flip down the middle, right here. That's where it's going to flip. Just keep that in mind. Alright, so again, that's my player. Let's add that little piece. Now, in order for me to flip, I need access to the sprite renderer. So let's do that too. So again, public sprite renderer. We'll call this the hero sprite renderer. And my hero sprite renderer, what it's going to do is when I'm going to the right, I don't want it to be flipped. So hero sprite renderer, I said dot flip on the x-axis is false when I'm going to the right. This is moving right. However, when I'm moving towards the left, I want this hero sprite renderer flip x to be true. I want to flip it when I go the other way. Okay, so that's the way you make it look differently. Alright, cool. Now one more thing I need to do, because I added these two connections, right? I have an animator and a sprite renderer that I need. Here's my animator. And here's my sprite renderer. If I can actually reach there. If I can't, just fold these up. Okay. And there we go. Alright, so we've got all of our connections. Let's try this out. So run it. And now we see that if I press D, I run to the right. If I press nothing, it stops. If I press left, it runs to the left. If I press space, it jumps. If I go to the right and then press space, it jumps. If I can flip really quickly, I can press space a lot, right? And I'm pretty good. Okay, so that's what the first thing I want to do with my guy, right? First thing we do is we fix our animations and our character so it looks good, right? And then we're going to do the next part. Again, one thing that I want to ask you guys as students of game development is, what's the difference between locomotion and animation? What's the difference? Locomotion, animation. Anybody? None of you are talking today. How about the guys over there on that table? John, tell me what the difference between locomotion and animation are. Locomotion, animation, what's the difference? No idea? Come on. You're not even thinking. You guys aren't paying attention. Locomotion is when I'm actually translating my character from one position to another. Locomotion. I'm moving my actual game object around, right? Animation is when there's something going on within the game object that's moving, all right? So here, I only have animation, right? So I can move my guy to the right, move my guy to the left, but there's not actually any movement. It's just my animation going left and right, okay? But locomotion is what I got to do next, which is moving my character around, like the screen. Alright, you know what? I'm pretty happy with this guy. The things that are missing now are my collider. Let's put my collider on. So again, I'm going to add different kinds of colliders. I recommend, for now, let's use our Capsule Collider 2D. Let me explain why Capsule. Capsule is a really cool option because I can kind of do this. I can kind of like, you know, pull him in like this, and his face is going to stick out of it, you know, whatever. but it's not so bad. I can also pull this in. I want to try and make the collider go over the majority of his body, this part. Typically his face wouldn't be so elongated, it would just like kind of stop here, but that's not the case in this case. He's got a kind of a weird looking face, and this is going to give us some challenges later. So that's his collider for now. Right, cool. I also need a rigid body 2D because I want him to, you know, to drop. I want physics to take hold, and we need a rigid body 2D to do that. So rigid body 2D is going to go in there. Now, question for you guys. What do you think the gravity scale should be? Gravity scale is 1. 1 is 9.8 meters per second squared. And if you think about, you know, how many pixels per meter, right? We're going to try and simulate gravity here. Normally, do you think that's good enough? The answer is no, right? Definitely not. You need like 3 or 4 times the gravity for it to work. And I'll show you the difference when we actually do gravity. So that's a little character. Alright, now that I've added in all this stuff, right, and this is the beginning, we're going to add more things later, I'm going to put this guy in the prefabs folder. So I'm going to drag and drop this player in the prefabs folder, so this way I can preserve him for the most part. And we're going to do the same stuff before we take a break, and the same stuff with the enemy. Let's do it. And I'm going to do it the exact same way. Alright, so again, I'm going to delete the player from the scene for now. And I'm going to go back to the enemy, and here's my enemy guy. This is good, but I want to use Texture Packer. Here's Texture Packer. I want to make kind of a new project. Right? Let's kill the old project. No, I don't want to save for now. And I want to do the same thing with Texture Packer. I want to go to the assets on the screen, which are desktop, Unity projects, and I'm going to go to assets, I'm going to go to textures, I'm going to go to enemy, and in my enemy I have a bunch. One thing to note about the enemy is he's only got one idle animation, which makes sense because he's not going to stay idle too long. He's going to be chasing the character pretty much all the time, right, the hero. So I'm going to grab all of his jump animations. He's got a few jump frames. Maybe we'll make him jump on top of the player's head or something. And there's some walking frames. He's got several walking frames, which looks to be about 12 frames of animation for walking. I'm going to drag and drop these in here. Now my character's a little scarecrow. He looks like this, right? So here's my little scarecrow. Okay, so my little scarecrow is pretty scary, but he needs to be about twice as big as he is right now. So instead of making him this big, I'm going to make him twice as big, and I don't want to do this in Unity. I want to plot him ahead of time. So again, going back down to Texture Packer Importer, or Texture Packer, I'm going to change the scale to 2. I also want to change his, from Max Rex, I want to go to Basic, which is going to make it so that it has it in order of name. So it's going to basically, I can test some of this stuff out. So let's take a look at his jump animation. So you can preview his animations here. This is what it looks like, right in Texture Packer. You can also make it faster if you think that's not fast enough. Same thing with his walking. Let's see what that looks like. That's not bad. I think that's pretty good. I think it might be a little fast. Probably want it to go like this. Right? A little better. Right, but that's him. That's his little character we're going to use. Again, I want some separation in terms of padding and shape. And what I want to do is I want to output this data. So just like we did before, I want to go back to our textures. I want to go to enemy. I want to make a new folder called sprites. And inside my sprites, I want to put in this enemy atlas. And this is good enough where I can just publish. And now that I've published everything, I can close Texture Packer down. And what this allows me to do is I can go back to my sprites. And inside my sprites, Unity has nicely imported everything, as you can see, same as before. And now let's make the little enemy character. So again, I'm going to pull the jump animation first. That seems to be first. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to call this jump. There he is. If I run this thing right now, you can see that he's going to perform his jump animation right nicely in Unity. But of course, this is just the enemy. So instead of making him called jump, it's going to be called enemy. And I also, before I take this stuff, I also want to get the walk animation in there. So again, let's grab the walk animation, put that in there, call that walk, right? And we don't need the other one. We only need one game object like that, so we can delete that one. But what it did do is it created two different clips and also a Animator Controller, which we're going to rename this one the Animator Controller. Maybe I have to rename that. And then inside of my animation folder, just to keep organized, I'm going to make another folder called Enemy. And in my sprites, I want to take my Enemy Animator Controller and my jumping and walk clips and take them into my enemy animations. My hero says Animator Controller 2, so we're pretty cool. I want to double click on my Enemy Animator Controller. Right now what I have is jump, and I don't want to make that the default. I want to make the default walk, so I'm going to drag and drop that in. Here it is. And I can right click and go set animation default state to walk. These are all repeats of what we just did earlier. Just like before, I want to have a chance to go from walking to jumping. Maybe my animator, my enemy with some AI, simple AI, is going to pursue the player and jump on his head. And I want to do that by going from walking to jumping state. So I'm going to make a transition and make a transition back. Except we should be able to go from jumping back to walking again. From a transition perspective, I definitely don't want there to be exit time in any one of the transitions, like we said before, or any kind of blend time. So the blend shape should be pretty much null here. I also want to set up a parameter, we'll call it the same thing, anim state, right? Which we're going to make a brand new parameter, a new integer parameter, anim state, sorry, I'll be okay. Where we're going to make it 0. When I go from walking, which is 0, to jumping, which is 1, I'm going to make a brand new, I'm going to say my anim state is going to be equal to 1. And on the way back, my anim state is going to be equal to 0. So all the same stuff we did last time. Furthermore, you know what? We're going to want to track the enemy's states. Right now, he only has 2 states, walking and jumping. Well, we could have other states that he's going to have for AI. He could have pursue. He can have flee. He can have patrol. He can have attack. He can have defend. He can have crying. He can have whatever, or whatever kind of states you want to have him, right? So in our scripts, we want to make a new enum. We're going to call this the enemy anim state. There we go. In the enemy anim state, what we're going to do is we're going to make changes from mono behavior, and we're going to make this an enum, an enumeration, as opposed to a class, because we don't need a class here. We're going to have a couple of states. One of them is going to be called the walk state, and the other one is the jump state for now. We're going to make this system.serializable. System.serializable. So it's available to us if we don't attach it, as well as put it in a namespace called util, so we can use it in a more modular way. There we go. And that should be good for the enum. So same thing we kind of did, we're just repeating ourselves from the player to the enemy. Now again, this is just the beginning. We're going to add more behavior here in the coming weeks. But for now, it's literally just jumping and walking. Going back to this, I need one more class. I need to create a new C# script, which I'm going to make the enemy controller. Here's my enemy controller. And in the enemy controller, we're going to using the util namespace, I'm going to set up a state for the enemy. So I'm going to make a public, again, it's the enemy anim state, which we're going to call enemy anim state. There we go. And for now, all I wanted to do is my enemy anim state is going to be to equal to enemy anim state dot walk, because he's going to walk at the beginning. All the enemies are going to walk around, basically. And they're going to be looking for the player. When they see the player, their line of sight, I want to use line of sight to see the player, and then when they see the player, they're going to speed up and attack the player. They're going to jump on the player, right? When they hit the player will die, or lose life, or whatever. Alright, so that is the basics of what's happening. I'm not going to change the update function right now because we're just making a stub for the enemy until we get to enemy AI later on. Alright, cool. So we've got our enemy, and what I want to do here is I want to drag and drop the enemy controller on top of the enemy. There it is. I also want access to the animator and the sprite renderer just like before, so let's just code that in. We won't need it today. So animator, enemy, animator, and public sprite renderer, enemy sprite renderer. And what we want to say is that you know, we want to have access to those things. If I want to flip the enemy's sprite, or if I want to change the enemy's animation state. Alright, those are the two reasons why we want to have that, those two things. So for now, what we want to do is we want to drag and drop those things into place. So sprite renderer, here we go, and animator, here we go. So all the same kind of stuff that we did before is what I want to kind of do now, because I think it's good for prep. Next, what I want to do is I want to add a Rigidbody 2D, here it is, as well as a collider. I want to add the same kind of collider we had before, which is a Capsule Collider for now. Capsule Collider 2D. And what I want to do is I want to be able to, there's my little guy, right? By the way, something to note, if you run this thing the way it is right now, you're going to see him fall, right? You can see it's going to happen right away. Hey, he's going to fall because he's got nothing to stand on, because he's got a little rigid body. But one thing to note is where his rigid body is going to be. Like I've got my capsule, here's my Capsule Collider. And you can see that the capsule kind of aligned pretty good. I want to kind of make it a little tighter for him. So there he is. He's pretty long as a character. That's our problem with him. So the other character has a really big head. This character is really long and skinny. And that's going to propose two different challenges for us, as opposed to something that's squarish. If you took Mega Man, that sprite, you can find the sprite sheet for Mega Man online, no problem. They're very square, right? So it's make it very easy for you to make a box collider. Here it's not square. It's a little bit more of a different shape, and it'll give us more chances to do interesting things. Alright, so now that we've got all this going on, we've kind of started off with our enemy. A couple things are missing. One of them is tagging. I want to add a new tag. I want to call this the enemy tag, because sometimes I want to kind of do some kind of collisions by tag. So let's go do that. And now that I've got him, I can go back to my prefabs and drag and drop my enemy into my prefabs folder. One thing I missed for the player is also to tag him as a player, the default tag. There we go. Questions around setting up the Animator Controller, the finite state machine in Unity, or how to use Texture Packer Importer with Texture Packer, and why we do all these crazy things. Again, I think Texture Packer is a great tool, guys. I highly recommend it. I think it saves you a lot of time, especially when it comes to splitting up a sprite sheet. Now, I have to admit that there are other tools out there that do the same kind of thing as well. That it's not just Texture Packer that does it. However, I think Texture Packer is becoming more and more industry standard in 2D games. So take a look at it when you have a chance. Alright, one more thing before we break. So I've got my enemy and my player, and I want to set up some platforms. I mean, we can't do a platformer without platforms, right? So let's do that. So I'm going to go back to my textures, and I'm going to go back to where it says tiles. And these tiles are basically the default tiles we're going to use. I'm going to just rename this to default tile set. Here's my default tile set. I have other ones too. You can see that they're fairly complex. If I was going to bring this up, you can see what they look like. There's a lot of different tiles, but these ones are fairly simple, so I'm going to go with those ones first. So default tile set, but however, they're not cut. They're not sliced up. So here's what I could do. I could pull this into another program, get it sliced up, turn it into little slices, bring it into Texture Packer, and bring it in here. Or let's do it the other way around this time. Let's use Unity Sprite Editor to do it for us. So here's Unity Sprite Editor. I'm going to kind of go here, click on Sprite Editor. By the way, I want to change this to multiple. Sprite Editor. And what this will do is it'll bring up the Unity Sprite Editor just like this. It's built into Unity. Okay? Alright, cool. So this is what I want to do. I want to be able to cut this up, slice it up, piece by piece. And if I go to Slice, you can see that I have automatic slicing. If I might detect, let me try click Slice. But normally it doesn't do a great job. As you can see, it just like kind of sees this as one big sprite. That's not cool. I could also do it grid by cell size, and I think this is a good way of doing it. Grid by cell size. Now, here's on a regular one. This is one that's a little bigger, but you can see that the other option, by the way, is instead of grid by cell size, grid by cell count. So how many cells do I have? And this is actually really accurate. How many cells do I have? You know, how many columns do I have? How many rows do I have? Well, I have 3 columns, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows, right? And if I click Slice, it slices them all up. Now these are very consistent looking tiles, and one thing to note is if I zoom in, it did a great job in slicing it exactly where it's supposed to be sliced. See? Right here in the corners and stuff. Something I don't like about this tile set is it's got these little white areas. I would love for these things to be transparent or black or whatever it's going to look like on your tile set. And also you get this black area right here, you know, that usually represents kind of like a transparent area. So these should have been transparent too, all these little areas. But I don't care. This is just a little example tile set. One thing to do also is from a sprite editor perspective, you can create a customs outline, a custom physics shape, and other secondary textures like, you know, if you want to use anything else, for example, normal maps and so on. Okay, cool. One thing I like to do now is each one of these has a name. So this is default tileset 0. Maybe we'll call this wave 0. So again, when you click on one of these things and click inside here, it automatically highlights. So wave 0. This will be wave 1. I want them to be descriptive. Wave 1. This will be wave 2. We got animals outside. Wave 2. We've got brick 1. Brick 1, 0 maybe. This is brick 1. Brick 1. I'm just naming them all. This is dirt with grass. Dirt with grass 0. This is dirt with grass 1. This is brick with grass 0. This is kind of a brick. Brick with grass 1. Hopefully I didn't mess that up, did I? I did. Brick with grass 1. I'm not really caring so much. This is just dirt 0. Dirt 0. This is dirt 1. I know it's watching paint peel when you watch me do this. And this is dirt with cracks 0. And this is dirt with cracks 1. Now usually the tile set's more descriptive. Dirt with cracks 1. I also have a couple other ones. I got what looks like a crate. And I also have what looks like ice, something like that. Okay, so a couple of blocks. There we go. Blocks are done. I click apply. And now what it does is it slices everything up nicely in Unity. if I go back now, I see that my default tile set has all these things, and it's nicely sliced up. Okay, so again, most of this should be common to you. You should have done most of this already. Anyone not do any of this stuff, like animations, cutting up tile sets? By the way, as you can see, just prepping for my platformer is taking a bit of time. I haven't started doing any movement or anything. This is just like prep work, because platforming is tough, and we haven't even done a background, scrolling, a tile set, you know, tile mapping in the background, none of that stuff. We're going to do all that next week, right? But let's add some stuff. I definitely want some kind of bricks, or maybe a brick with grass. I want to kind of add it in here, or maybe dirt with grass. Maybe that might be the best one. I'm going to kind of put one tile set in there, so there's one. And I also want to put dirt with grass 1, so maybe a couple of variations. No, it's brick with grass. Dirt with grass 1. So again, a couple of variations. Again, if you want to snap them together, you can use Vertex Snapping. So press V while you're you have, you know, kind of your corner set, and they'll snap to the corner. So press V for vertex, right? And again, what you want to try and do is you want to make a couple platforms. You check what it looks like in the game, where they're sitting. Again, you can tell there's a bit of issues with them. So let's just copy paste. So we'll get both of those, and then Control D, and then we'll just do one of these and kind of pull them out. And we'll do vertex snapping on the left, and we'll snap them together, so to create almost like a little platform. And this is a great place for our character to kind of land. As you can see, he's going to have a space to run. So again, here's our scene. And I probably want to make him, this whole platform, just put it to the right a little bit, maybe even off screen. So you can see that it's kind of off screen like this. And maybe what I want to do is I want to copy this platform so there's a place for him to jump onto. So to do that, I think it's good if I create something called platform. Let's do that together. Now there's a couple of ways I can do this. Each block could have its own collider, right? What do you think of that? Each block having its own collider. What if I have like 50 blocks, 100 blocks, 200 blocks, 500 blocks? It's a lot of colliders, and you don't need it. So what I recommend instead is one block have a collider, or the entire platform have a collider, and you spread it out, right? So that can be a bit of a challenge, but which is something different than I did earlier today. For today though, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to make platforms. I'm just using them as testing grounds for our characters. Later on next week we'll do tile mapping, and it'll be totally different. So again, I'm just going to select all this stuff. I'm going to click Add Component. I'm going to click a Box Collider 2D. I'm going to add each one of these things going to have their own box collider. Okay, so that's what it's going to have. And then I'm going to duplicate them. So duplicate. And then I'm going to add another platform kind of over here, where maybe some of the character can maybe run and jump to. Okay, something like that. Again, you may want to make this taller or smaller depending on how far you think the character should jump in your game. For me, I just want two platforms, one here, and then I want to be able to get the character to jump over there. Okay. Cool. Pretty straightforward. All right. One thing to note is I don't have to have these platforms here at all have any kind of rigid body. I could have rigid body, but that would be a little bit overkill. You'd have to constrain them pretty good. So I'm going to go back to my prefabs. Notice I'm not making these prefabs. I'm going to get my player prefab and bring him in. And he's at 0, 0, 0. Let's move him where he's supposed to be, or move the platform, one of the two. Let's move this platform. This might be easier to do. There we go. And what I want to do is I want to move the player object itself like way up here. So he's going to drop down. Alright, so this is what it looks like right now. So, boom, boom, he falls. And, wow. Guys, that's not exciting, right? Look, let me show you that again. Sometimes what I like to do also is, I'd like to pull the scene, maybe at the bottom, and have my, what it looks like here at the top, right? So again, a little bit less real estate, but for this is cool. Notice that if I do that again, so here it is, so I kind of drag the player and then drop him, you can see that it kind of floats to the ground like he has some kind of parachute. Why? Because he's using a regular gravity. Guys, like I said, regular gravity is just not exciting enough for platformers. You need to increase the gravity range. So to do that, you can see that on the right for the player, he has a rigid body. You can go down to where it says gravity, and I'm going to change the gravity scale, guys, to 4. Curious, someone asked me this morning, what if I just increase the mass? Won't that just increase the way it falls? Does mass affect how fast we fall? No. Physics tells us that. Actually, Galileo, he was the first guy that kind of figured this out, right? He said, well, if I take a rock, or if I take, a larger object and I drop it off a cliff, right, they're going to both fall down, give or take, at the same rate. Give or take, because there's, depending on the shape of the object, you could have more air resistance. Surface area and all that stuff. But for the most part, they fall the same rate. Even if I took 2 heavy objects, it doesn't matter, right? So yeah, mass doesn't make any difference here, but gravity, I'm changing the world's gravity just for my player. So my player will fall faster in general. Physics gravity will work harder on him than it will for the rest of the world. Okay? So that's this. So again, if I have him fall now, you can see that he's going to fall much faster. And watch how that works. So boom, boom, and then he just falls. And I think that looks a lot better, a little bit more lively, a little bit more exciting than how he fell last time. One thing I can also do for the player, which I highly recommend to you guys, is give him a physics material, right? So again, under materials, I want to add a new object called a physics material, 2D. And we'll call this the player physics material, right? And if I go to the player object, I can drag and drop his physics material on top of his there's 2. You notice there's one here under Capsule Collider 2D, and there's another one here under his rigid body. I want to put it on the rigid body on this part. So what does this do? What does the physical this thing do? Well, friction by default is 0.4. I can increase my friction to 1, so it's going to be like highly like a lot of friction on his feet. He's going to slide, but he's going to stop. Let's make his bounciness 1. If you notice what happens when I make his bounciness 1, and if I drop the player, you can see what's going to happen to him. He's just going to keep on bouncing and bouncing and bouncing and bouncing forever, pretty much. Bouncing 1 means 100% restitution. It'll keep on bouncing forever. If you wanted to make bouncing balls in your scene or something that was bouncing around for the player to ignore, this is 1. Notice that he's getting higher and higher as well. It's going to go higher and higher and bigger because his bounce is actually really awesome. Until the point where he gone. Okay? So bouncing 1, not a great idea. Bouncing like 0.2, just to give you a little bit of bounce, right, is okay if he falls from a high distance. Watch. So if he bounces, boom, right? And if you let him kind of go from a higher distance, whoa, undo. If you make this guy, not the camera, the player. If you make the player go for like a high distance and drop him, right, then he bounces a little bit, right? That's okay. But he's not going to bounce a lot. Here's another problem with the player. What if I move the player over here and then I drop him off the cliff? What happens to him? Well, actually, he has a problem with this. He'll just fall like he's made of putty. And that doesn't really look good for video games, right? I don't want him to fall like that. Let me show you that again, right? So again, I'm going to move this closer so you can see it this way. If I take my character and I move him over here, right, and then I press play, watch what happens to him. So he's there, he falls, and if I move him to the edge, he'll just fall down, right? Guys, that's bad. That's really bad. So what I want to do is I want to take the player and add a rigid body constraint. So I go to the constraints area. I want to say freeze rotation across the z-axis. So he can't rotate. He can only just go up and down, left and right. Again, now if I do it, even if I did the exact same thing, and if I move right to the corner, he'll just slide off, right, and fall down, which is what I'm expecting him to do. So that's more rigid body stuff. And I adjusted my player by adding a physics material. Alright? So again, because if I adjusted my player, I'm going to go to overrides, I'm going to add apply all, and now he's going to have a physics material attached to him. Okay, it's about time I get my player moving around, because without my player moving around, I'm going to have an issue. But we're going to do that after the break. So let's take a short break. Again, 10 to 15 minutes, and when we come back, I'll put this on GitHub. In the meantime, we'll come back, we'll do player movement, which is going to take pretty much the remainder of the time we have. Because it's going to be all about gameplay.